The number of people living in extreme poverty has fallen sharply over the past 30 years. In 1990, about 40% of the world's population lived in extreme poverty, or 2 billion people, but that has dropped to about 10% of the world's population, or about 700 million people. This was mainly caused by the enormous economic growth of mainly Asian countries, which made people richer. But why are some other countries so poor? Since there is no easy answer to this, we will answer this question using different geographic perspectives. The main causes of poverty are discussed from a natural, historical, economic and political perspective. We start with the natural perspective. In this perspective, the natural environment is mentioned as a cause of poverty, while other countries are lucky with their natural environment. Rich countries may have had an advantage. For example, there are many raw materials which can supply industries and profits can rise. It is also possible that the land has a fertile soil. This is often the case in deltas, areas where distributaries are formed just before they flow into the sea, making the land fertile. Furthermore, some countries have natural harbors and navigable rivers which make trade easier and profits can rise. Other countries lack these opportunities and therefore have fewer opportunities for development. For example, some countries do not have access to the sea. We call these countries landlocked countries. These are countries that do not have access to the sea but are therefore dependent on their neighbors for trade. Examples are Mongolia, the Central African Republic and Paraguay. Then the historical perspective. A country can still be affected by the country's history. This includes, for example, the slave trade or other consequences of the colonial past. Think of the artificial boundaries drawn by colonial powers. Because these borders did not coincide with the borders of the habitat of different groups of people, some groups had to live together in one country, and conflicts arose, which seriously hindered the development of the country. Some see the world system, which is divided into the center, the periphery, and the semi-periphery, as a result of the colonial past. They argue that it is very difficult for countries to take a different position in this world system, and that it is therefore extremely difficult for countries to experience economic growth. The next perspective is the economic perspective. Most important is the poverty trap. Normally, we assume that an investment today will lead to higher income in the future, whether that future is tomorrow, next week, next year, or in 10 years. But people trapped in poverty do not have enough money to invest in themselves or their families. For example, they have too little money to buy food, so that tomorrow they have less energy and can work less hard or less long, and therefore earn even less tomorrow. Another example is that investments in healthcare can be postponed, causing people to become ill and unable to work in the future, which in turn reduces income. Only after a certain amount of income, the return on investments increases so that they can become richer in the future. People who are drawing attention for foreign aid support this vision. Yet there are also researchers who question the poverty trap. For example, they argue that a varied diet can be put together with little money, even in the poorest areas in the world, and that healthcare measures, such as vaccinations, are extremely cheap nowadays, so that even the poorest can afford it. As a result, their future, with less illness and more income by being able to work harder or longer, could quickly rise. The fact that the poorest do not choose to invest the money in varied food and healthcare is due to other causes, such as the lack of knowledge. So they argue that the poverty trap does not exist. Other economic characteristics include a lack of good education and good healthcare. Poor education means that the talent that the people have is not used, and poor healthcare can cause people to die at a young age. The final economic feature is a deteriorating terms of trade. In the video about global shift, you have already seen that by exporting unprocessed raw materials, poorer countries can often import fewer products in the future with the same amount of export. The last perspective is the political perspective. Wars and conflicts caused by artificial borders often have a destabilizing effect on a country, making economic growth difficult. Some scientists emphasize that a malfunctioning government can be a huge constraint to economic growth. If there is good and neutral legislation in a country, it pays off for the people to invest in a new invention. They can apply for a patent for their invention so that others cannot copy it, and so they can sell the invention and make money from it. Such an invention can be an innovation that can ultimately lead to economic growth. This stimulates creative thinking, which will lead to many new innovations. In many countries, however, the government is not functioning properly. As a result, inventions are not protected and there is no incentive to innovate, which ultimately is a brake on economic growth. That is why some researchers point out that there must first be a properly functioning government. Another argument that falls under the political perspective and coincides with the previous one is corruption. When civil servants are bribed, the government often does not function properly and neutrally. In addition, it may be the case that by no means always the most suitable people hold a position, but that often friends or relatives of, for example, the president are chosen to do this work. Elections may also be manipulated. There are reports that, for example, ballots were handed in before the polling stations opened, that there were more ballots than those entitled to vote, and that some people were able to vote multiple times, so that ultimately the ruling party remained in power. Real reforms are stopped in this way. A final political argument takes place on a global scale. The IMF and the World Bank provide poor countries with loans to develop, but they must implement economic reforms dictated by the IMF or the World Bank as a condition to apply for loans. Since the IMF and the World Bank are always led by a European or an American, some argue that it is the IMF and the World Bank that determine a country's policy. This policy has not always been beneficial to the recipient country in both the long and short term, according to critics. Remember that every country is unique and there is no standard reason that every country is poor. Often it is a combination of the reasons mentioned. This means that policies aimed at reducing poverty are also adjusted to the characteristics of the country. In short, there is no easy fix, no easy method to reduce poverty.